Okay, hello guys, welcome back. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about American public reaction. Now, all through the course, there are some moments where we look at this. Now, the course is predominantly about kind of politics and on a political level, what are the leaders of the countries doing, diplomacy, things like that. But at certain points, we do go in and look at the public and how the public deal with things. We looked at it when we looked at the Red Scare in the 20s. We looked at it when we looked at the arms race. And we're going to go back and look at it now. We're going to look at a particular thing which is known as McCarthyism. Now, that might trigger some kind of knowledge in you. You might already know what that means. And what I do want to contextualize is that when we do our America course, we do a module on America, and all these things, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, we look at in a bit more detail anyway, so they kind of overlap each other. But I'm going to kind of talk to you about this because we haven't done America yet, so you won't know it, maybe, or maybe you do, who knows. Anyway, so what we care about right now is, as we know, contextually, we're kind of in the 50s and the 60s. So at this point, how do people in America feel? Are they involved in the Cold War? Is there campaigns against it? Is there kind of paranoia and fear spreading? We know that the public were quite involved in the arms race. We know they were quite involved in kind of a paranoia about that. But we're now thinking about kind of the same reaction as the Red Scare, a reaction to the Cold War as a whole, a reaction to communism, but the 50s and 60s. In the 20s, with the Red Scare, the public became very, very worried, and there was kind of fear and paranoia spreading, hysterical, paranoid level almost, we might call it. Lots of reaction to immigration, especially from Russians. So Russian immigration was causing lots of kind of tension. And what we're going to look at today is how has that changed by the 50s and 60s? How are ordinary people feeling about this? Now, in a nutshell, there's a growing sense of fear among ordinary people. There's a very real fear that people feel that they're being spied on, and that all over America, there are these Russian Soviet spies who are kind of there to spy on them. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, what we might term McCarthyism and this 50s and 60s reaction to the Cold War. Right, when I was thinking about this, it made me think about a show that I've actually watched quite a lot of, I got quite into, on Amazon Prime, called The Americans. And if I just move out the way, we've got the two kind of main characters there, and they're obviously set on a background of Washington, the White House in America. Now, this series is about a couple, these two people here, who live a life in America. They have two kids. And they're very ordinary Americans. They both have jobs. They're kind of a tourist. They run a tour company to send people abroad. But actually undercover, they're Soviet spies. And they were placed in America kind of 10, 15 years ago. And their cover is so deep rooted. They even got married and had children who were brought up as Americans, that they kind of can do a lot of things because they're so deep in American society. Now, that is what American people were afraid of. These undercover Soviet spies that were everywhere, hiding under the bed, next door neighbor, around the corner, your child's teacher at school. And this kind of hysteria is what we need to kind of contextualize this whole thing in, because it sounds a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? You can't just judge and worry about everyone, or you'd be there all day, you'd spend your life worrying. But we need to kind of contextualize it in this understanding. So if you do have access to Amazon Prime and you wanted to kind of give this a watch, you could have a go at looking at it. It's a good series, a really good series actually. So while this is to some level paranoia, we do know that spies played a crucial part in the Cold War, especially by this point, the 50s and the 60s. So, there is a justification to an extent. And what we need to kind of decide today is how far that justification, that paranoia is justified. How far it was, a justified belief that actually there were lots and lots of spies working, or how far did the public take this too far? And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Right, in order to understand why the public would be fearful, we need to understand and remind ourselves of the context that we are in by the 50s. So by the 50s, Americans genuinely feel threatened by communism. We know that communism dominated Eastern Europe. We know that it dominates half of Germany. We know it's also in China and in North Korea. Now, Americans have watched the war in Korea, 1950, 1953, and we know that at this point, we currently have a conflict between the French and the Viet Minh in Vietnam. So that doesn't end until 1954. So America has watched quite a big chunk of Asia also fall or have to fight for communism, or to stay independent from communism. So it's a very much present issue in the minds of Americans. And I've got a map behind me, and I'm just going to move out the way, but all the area in red is communist. Now you can see that it's quite a big chunk of the world. It just so happens that the USSR and China are both very, very big countries, so they dominate a lot of the landmass. But all of this area, we've got China, we've got the USSR, we've got Eastern Europe over here, and we've got parts of Asia. If we look at this number of people, here's the people in the world, and the blue people are people who kind of have normal democracies, and the red is the communists. So you can see that even quite a big chunk of people in the world are now under communist regimes. Domino theory obviously means the spreading, and you can see why America might be fearful. If it came this way, obviously we wrap round and we're straight in America, but even from this way, we've got a big swathe of the world in this direction is falling or has fallen to communism. So that threat, the threat of the domino theory, is very, very real in American minds. Now you add to that the current situation with the arms race, and it gets kind of even worse. So we're in we know that the atom bomb, the USSR developed an atom bomb in 1949, and that at that point, both sides have nuclear weapons. By 1953, both sides have hydrogen bombs. And at the same time, we have the space race. We know that in 1957, Sputnik 1 and then Sputnik 2 in the same year, and then Explorer 1 in 1958 by the USA, give an elevated fear of the ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missiles that can be flown from space and launched at countries. And that heightens the fear of nuclear war. So by the late 50s, by 1958, everyone has nuclear weapons, everyone has hydrogen bombs, and everyone has the ability to send man-made satellites into space. So it's really heightened fear of paranoia by this point, by the end of the 50s. We've also seen an element of aggressive Soviet policy in the Berlin blockade that happened, much earlier in the late 40s. But it shows that at every stage of the Cold War, rather than looking at it in isolation, we need to kind of consider everything together. So we can't understand popular reaction in the 50s and 60s without understanding all of these events that turned everything communist: Chinese Communist Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the Eastern Bloc, along with the process of the arms race and the space race. We have to understand everything in context to really understand why there is this heightened paranoia of the American public at this time. Based on the domino theory, they genuinely thought they were under a threat. So to kind of combat this threat and this feeling of very real fear, the American government decided to do something, and they established the HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committees. Now this is established in 1938, and this scene behind me is a scene of people, members of the board, discussing, cases, things like that. But if you're wondering what's behind me, that's what's happening. So what this board did was it questioned those who it believed might be involved in communist activities. Witnesses were interviewed and asked if they'd ever been members of the Communist Party, and if they had, who else they'd seen at meetings. And it became a situation where you either had to choose between confessing yourself or naming others, okay? And most people that were named were innocent. So it's becoming a bit of a silly situation where you're pulled up whether you're innocent or not, you make a choice. Do I kind of sacrifice myself or do I name others? Most people, human nature is going to be, especially if you're innocent, well, I didn't do anything wrong, but you know, I think my neighbor and I think my child's school teacher, I've seen them talking at the gate, you know, and they looked very suspicious, I'm going to name them. Those two get pulled into questioning. Those two name two others, and you see how it becomes like a pyramid effect. We start with one person who names two, each of those people name two, and they name two, and we end up with hundreds and hundreds of people being interviewed for being spies or involved in communist activities when really nobody did anything wrong in the first place. And that actually, out of fear for their own safety, people name others to try and get out of the problem. And that's essentially what the HUAC did. So we might, you know, say today in kind of analysis, we might say that it did more harm than good, even because it didn't really root out many genuine communist spies. It just created kind of hysteria, paranoia, and the naming of people just to try and avoid problems. Now, they did sentence some people in courts, and they had big publicized trial cases. And one of those cases we're going to have a look at in a bit more detail. So the man that I'm kind of in front of is a man called Alger Hiss. And in 1950, he was found to have passed secrets to the USSR. He worked as a State Department official, and he was denounced by another man by the name of Chambers. So somebody else was pulled into the HUAC and named Alger Hiss rather than accepting responsibility for anything themselves. So it was that same situation of that pyramid effect. I'm here, I'm being interviewed, okay, well, I'm just going to name someone else. So he was named by Chambers. He served a 5-year sentence for his role in this. However, it is debated today whether he, you know, had any involvement at all, whether any of this was even true. And it goes so far that in the 1990s, 2 former senior Soviet military officers responsible for the Soviet Union's military intelligence archives stated that following a thorough search of the archives, we found that Russian intelligence service had no documents proving that Alger Hiss had cooperated with our service anywhere or with anything. So he maintains his innocence, and even the Soviet Union is saying that Hiss never had any relationship with Soviet intelligence. He has now passed away, but he maintained his innocence to his death. What this did was it led to a new height of investigation into the White House, because he obviously worked for the government. So it led to this new paranoia that actually these Soviet spies are embedded even in the White House itself, and we need to do something about this. We need to root out these people from the upper echelons of our society. Now, there's one other case I want to look at, and I'm going to take you there now. Okay, so I'm now with a couple, a married couple, and their names are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and they were arrested and executed, having been proved and convicted of spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. Now, again, people maintain their innocence. Their son maintains their innocence to this day. And again, it's a situation where, you know, there wasn't extensive proof. Now, the reason that Alger Hiss got 5 years and they were executed for this is there was more proof for them than Alger Hiss. They were accused of providing top secret information about radar, sonar, jet propulsion engines, and nuclear weapon designs, and they were executed in New York in 1953. So this shows how strongly committed, I guess, the HUAC was to rooting out communism and rooting out Soviet spies, because they sentenced them to death. Right, in any given situation, there's always somebody who takes advantage of it, isn't there? And I'm sat with someone who very much did that. Now, this is Joseph McCarthy, the man who I guess this whole lesson is named after. Now, he was a Wisconsin senator, and he became a very, very key figure in this search and this struggle to root out communists from society, especially from government and positions of power. He recognized the opportunity to gain publicity and support, and his methods have become known and kind of characterized as a witch hunt. He went on a witch hunt to find people. He primarily targeted the entertainment industry, the rival Democratic Party, so he's a Republican, and universities, so, you know, intelligentsia, those kind of people. Today we call this McCarthyism, which actually has its own definition as kind of unfounded allegations, blaming someone or accusing someone without proof. And his allegations destroyed many careers, and individuals faced persecution and blacklisting simply by being named by Joseph McCarthy, whether there was any proof or not. So we enter now kind of quite a dark period in American politics and public opinion, because many people's lives were genuinely, utterly ruined by this. You know, they had to leave America even. Now, one very, very famous group of people who were targeted by McCarthy were Hollywood actors. And one very famous individual, Charlie Chaplin, was accused. He struggled to get new roles. He actually left America and came to Europe after this. Another very famous case was the Hollywood 10. Now, you can see some protest movements behind me, but the Hollywood 10 were basically a group of very well-known directors, actors, people involved in Hollywood who were accused and blacklisted because of McCarthy. Now, I'm not going to go so much into this. When we do America, we go into it more, but basically, they kind of stood up for themselves more. They refused to say whether they were communist or not, because they said, we live in America, the land of the free. You know, why does it matter? And it all escalated, and yeah, you can research it if you want. I'm not going to talk about it now. We'll talk about it when we do America. But what you need to know for the Cold War course is that the Hollywood 10, people like Charlie Chaplin, were involved in accusations by Joseph McCarthy. And this shows just how far the hysteria, the paranoia about communism had spread in America. McCarthy's kind of terror only ended when he accused a group of soldiers and people in the Navy, and people just kind of finally realised and recognised this had gone too far, and it just become a witch hunt of this one man, okay? It wasn't only Joseph McCarthy that played a role in exaggerating and, you know, what's the word, kind of invigorating this fever from the people about communism. The director of the FBI, John Edgar Hoover, was convinced that communists had infiltrated every area of American life. Teachers were being accused of being re-educators, so kind of Soviet spies who were playing as teachers to re-educate children, the new generation. And he launched surveillance programs on high-profile politicians and public figures. This led to a very real feeling of Reds under the bed, and I've got a cartoon, a propaganda picture here of this, you know, American looking under the bed for the communists hiding there. And over this side, we've got a poster that actually says the Red Menace is real. So in America at this time, it's just everywhere, this feeling of communism infiltrating life. It shows how afraid people in America were of the impact of communism on their life, of kind of killing the American dream, of ruining everything America stands for, and maybe shows why people like Truman and Eisenhower were committed, and Johnson were committed to trying to prevent communism in places like Vietnam and across the world. Right, the very last thing I want to talk to you about is kind of a high level, kind of a grade 7 to grade 9 link that you can make when you think about this. Now, some of you might have read this already and be thinking, I was starting to see that. But an American playwright, Arthur Miller, recognized the similarities of what was happening in America in the 1950s and what had happened in earlier American history, the time of the witch hunts. And he writes a play, which is today very, very famous, called The Crucible in 1952. This dramatizes the events of a very small religious community in the 17th century, where people became hysterical, believing in accusations of witchcraft, kind of in reawakening the idea of the Salem witch hunt or the witch trials. The only way to save your life if you have been accused is to accuse others. Very, very similar to what was happening with the HUAC and their investigations and interviews. And women, you know, accused of witchcraft, you won't be executed if you name someone else, that kind of thing. All sense of reason is lost, and 20 people are executed for being witches. Now, Miller is careful not to make any direct reference to McCarthyism, but his message is absolutely clear. And it can be considered an allegory to what was happening with McCarthyism in America. So it's a very nice link for you. You can reference, you know, the play The Crucible as a kind of a high level piece of specific evidence. So that's it really. We just need to know about McCarthyism, who Joseph McCarthy was, what was happening with the HUAC, the names of some of the individuals who were accused of espionage, and the link to the Crucible. And that kind of encompasses what we need to know about public reaction to the Cold War in the 1950s and going into the 60s.